So it's our great honor and to today have a truly transformational scientist in terms of the work that she has been pursuing. Lisa Feldman Barrett is a distinguished professor in psychology and the director of the Interdisciplinary Affective Science Lab at Northeastern University in Boston. She has done a very large number of things. One of the things that stand out is that she has been funded without a break for 20 years by the National Institute of Health, NIH, which is something that we need to ask her how you do that. And she has written many papers. So of course, her groundbreaking work is on trying to figure out what exactly emotions are, where they come from. One of the things is that she's recently published a book which was really interesting and eye-opening, I found personally, on how emotions are made, which is a popular book, but still based on pure science. She works regularly with the Harvard Medical School and the Massachusetts General Hospital in neuroscience and computer science and neuroscience. And the medical domain, I suppose. There are too many awards to mention, so I will not go through them. Instead, I hope we'll let Lisa speak for herself. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So I'd like to start by thanking Michelle and the rest of the program committee, the organizing committee, host committee, and particularly I guess it was the students or I arrived in my room last night very late after 2 canceled flights and quite an odyssey to get here for this morning to a bouquet of flowers and champagne and chocolates. Which I have to say is a first in my experience in over 25 years of speaking. I don't think I've ever, chocolates, yes, but not flowers and food. That was really lovely. So it's a real honor and a real pleasure to be here to talk to you today. I basically want to start with an observation that will not be that surprising to you. Which is that lots of tech companies are trying to figure out how to detect emotion by reading biological signals, including facial movements. And it's a really exciting time because the technology is advancing very quickly, in part thanks to your efforts, or the efforts of a lot of people in this room. And the pace is picking up. And there is a growing economy of emotion reading gadgets and apps and algorithms. But the question that I want to ask today is whether or not it's really possible for a machine to read emotion in a face or a body. And if you think that the answer is yes, what I want to suggest to you is that there may be a way for us to do it even better than we are doing it right now. Although I would challenge us on the question of whether or not we actually are doing it. Nonetheless, there are plenty of companies, who already are claiming that they are able to do it. The idea being that the foundation of this idea is that emotions can be objectively read in faces and bodies and other biological signals. And the punchline that I'm going to offer you today is just basically more like a friendly warning, which I think will challenge some of the deeply held beliefs that at least some of you hold. And the first point is that I would suggest to you that any claims that we are reading emotions successfully are at this point exaggerating what we can actually do. And I think many of the companies that we read about in the newspaper and online are actually misrepresenting what they can do. And my message, the second part of my message today, is not that machines can't perceive emotions, but more that affective computing may be going about this in the wrong way because of a fundamental misunderstanding of what emotions are and how they work. And as a consequence, we might be missing what I think of as a game-changing opportunity here to really redefine the science of emotion in a way that far exceeds the boundaries of the field of affective computing. So basically what I'm here to tell you today is that you guys in this room and other people who do what you do have an opportunity to actually fundamentally solve a problem that scientists have been asking at least since the time of William James. And in a way that will fundamentally affect neuroscience and psychology and other fields which can draw on the insights that really this audience is uniquely equipped to address. So emotion reading technology usually starts with the assumption that people, I'm going to start really by focusing on the face, work on the face. The assumption is that people are supposed to smile when they're happy, they're supposed to frown when they're sad, they're supposed to scowl when they're angry, and that everyone around the world is supposed to be able to recognize smiles and frowns and scowls as expressions of emotion. And this is the assumption that leads companies to claim that they can detect happiness when in fact what their algorithms are doing are detecting smiles. So in the media, and even some people in this room have written papers which say that algorithms can detect anger when in fact what the algorithms are detecting is scowling. And so the assumption is that scowling is a reliable indicator of anger, that smiling is a reliable indicator of happiness, and so on and so forth. And so I want you to consider this evidence. Here are the facial configurations that are assumed to universally express anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. I'm only focusing on these 6 because you can only fit so much data on one slide. But what I'm about to say about these 6 really holds for any emotion category that's ever been studied in this way. So how often do people actually spontaneously make these facial movements during episodes of the given emotion? And the answer from a recent meta-analysis is not so frequently. So the y-axis here is the proportion of times that people make actually any part of any AUs, any action units of the proposed facial expression, universal facial expression. And the N refers to the number of studies that have been published. These are just proportions. There are also studies that use correlations, that look at correlations between the presence of an AU or the magnitude of the presence of that AU and self-report ratings of emotional experience. And the first thing you'll notice is there aren't that many studies. That's a problem that we can talk about. But of the studies that do exist, the findings are pretty clear. So let's take scowling, for example. So on average, the data show, meta-analytic data show, that people scowl about 30% of the time when they're angry. So that means scowling that's significantly better than chance, right? So that means scowling is an expression of anger. But it also means 70% of the time people are not scowling when they're angry. They're doing other things with their face, reliably when they're angry. Sometimes people smile when they're angry. Sometimes they cry when they're angry. Sometimes they have a complete stone-faced stare when they're angry. And even more concerning is that people scowl when they're not angry. People scowl when they're confused. They scowl when they're concentrating. They scowl when they have gas. My husband makes a full-on facial scowl when he is concentrating very, very intensely, which you can imagine if he were married to someone else, what that would be like, being married to him, right? You guys aren't laughing. You should be laughing much. Can you imagine your spouse is paying attention to you and scowling really, Now, there are many, many, many more studies which show people these posed configurations and ask them to infer, or they would say recognize the emotion being portrayed. And here are the data. This is from a meta-analysis in 2002. So and again, the proportions are on the y-axis. So you can see there's quite a difference here. There's a huge discrepancy. And which are the data that companies use when they're building their algorithms? They're using these data. So this is why there is this widely pervasive belief that software can detect anger or sadness or fear. Software can detect scowling, under ideal conditions, can detect scowling and smiling and so on pretty well. But that's not the same thing as detecting an emotion. And why is it that the blue bars are so much higher than the white bars? Let me show you why. In the typical experiment, and we're talking here now about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of experiments, some of which maybe even you yourself have run. Test subjects are shown a face, usually an exaggerated caricature, and a small set of words, and they're asked to pick the word that best matches the face. In other studies, usually done in small-scale, remote cultures, you might tell a very impoverished, brief story about emotion, like Bobby's dog died, Bobby feels sad. And then you might show two faces, a smiling face and a frowning face, and ask subjects to pick which face matches the story. These are called choice from array tasks. And on average, across, this is a meta-analytic average, across categories and subjects across different studies, 67% of the time, subjects choose the expected emotion. This is reported as accuracy on the assumption that people actually make these faces when they're in emotional states. And so to us, it really feels as if we can look at someone's face and read the emotions that are there just in the same way that we would read words on a page. And I guess what I would suggest to you is, in fact, in these studies, that's exactly what's happening. Subjects are reading words and they're picking words that match faces. What happens when you take the words away and you just ask people to freely label the face? Well, accuracy plummets. And for some categories, like contempt, shame, and embarrassment, and so on, accuracy is no different from chance. And look what happens when we add a little cultural diversity. Things get really interesting. So in my lab, we went to Tanzania to test the Hadza hunter-gatherers. This is a hunting and gathering community, or communities in Tanzania. These folks have been hunting and gathering continuously since the Pleistocene. They have the oldest mitochondrial DNA on the planet, and there are about 125 to 150 of these adults left, actually, in this community for a number of reasons. When we give them this task, the standard task, using this choice from array task, we see them choose the correct face to match the story about 25% of the time. This is an inflated estimate because it actually also involved in this computation is their ability to distinguish pleasant from unpleasant, happy from, smiling from the other faces. And so when we only look at negative emotions, we see a percentage that is not statistically different from chance. So the evidence for universal emotional expressions vanishes, basically. And just so that you're aware of the fact that this is not a unique finding, what I'm going to do is summarize for you now all of the studies from small-scale remote samples that have ever been published in the literature. So across the horizontal axis here is, I've partitioned the findings in terms of the magnitude of support for universality. This partitioning comes from a paper by John Haidt and Dacher Keltner in 1999. So unsupported is an effect size less than 0.2. Weak support is 0.2 to 0.4. Moderate support is 0.4 to 0.7, and strong support is anything above 0.7. So, and then I've also organized the studies by the type of method that's used. So at the bottom, choice from array is really the most confirmatory type of method, where this is where you're giving people a face, you're showing them a face and giving them a set of words and asking them to pick the word that matches the face. And at the top is free labeling, which is the most discovery-based and unconstrained method. So here are the original Ekman studies that were published in the late 60s and early 70s. There are basically 2 peer-reviewed papers and Paul's Nebraska Symposium chapter, and that was it until 2008. And now there are almost 20 published papers from an array of sampling a much broader number of populations using a much broader array of methods. And what you'll see is the majority of these studies do not find support for universality. And here are the 2 studies that we did with the Hadza. The Hadza also are a really important population. I'm not going to spend too much time on them today, but they basically live in a lifestyle that is similar, not identical to, but similar to the lifestyle of our hunting and gathering ancestors. So what I want to be really clear here, they're not an ancient people. This is a modern, it's a modern group of people, but they are living this lifestyle that, according to evolutionary psychology, are the conditions under which so-called universal emotions emerged. And you don't see evidence of these emotion categories with these expressions in that population. And in this case, I can use the word population pretty clearly because there are only about 125 adults left. And just for completeness, we decided to go back to the original experimental method and confirm that this method of telling a story and showing people faces, or telling a story and presenting them with posed vocalizations, or showing them a face, or having them hear a posed vocalization and having them pick words, that this can make any emotion category look universal. So we identified 6 emotion categories from different cultures that have never been claimed as universal. They don't actually exist in English as single words, or in Hadzane, which is the language spoken by the Hadza, or in any Chinese language, which was the 3rd culture we tested. And then we invented vocalizations for them. We just made them up, pre-tested them on American subjects, kind of like where those facial expressions came from. So for example, giggle is an emotion category from the Philippines. Does anyone here know this emotion category, giggle? It's an awesome category. It means an overwhelming urge to squeeze or pinch something which is unbearably cute. And then we invented a sound, a vocalization for giggle. Can anyone guess what that might sound like? Imagine. Yeah, like, yeah! And then we asked our test subjects. In this case, we used American subjects, but we also used subjects from the Hadza and also subjects from a rural Chinese sample to match the sound to a story about emotion. And the average accuracy was 57%, which is not statistically different from the accuracy rates for anger, sadness, fear, disgust, and so on. And so out of those 6 categories, 5 of them look universal. And what's interesting is the same 5, it's not the same 5. It's depends on which sample you're looking at. But basically, in all samples, 5 of the 6 look universal. So that's where the blue bars come from. Scientists have been using an experimental method that does not discover evidence for universal facial expressions of emotion. It manufactures that evidence. And this method is responsible for the scientific belief that the scowl is the expression of anger instead of one of many expressions of anger, and so on. And so if you want to build AI that perceives emotion in humans, then you have to realize that these famous configurations are neither consistently or specifically displaying the proposed emotion with sufficient, it may be sufficient statistics to get you a publication, but it's not sufficient that anybody in this room would want their outcomes determined by these faces, right? If in a court of law, someone is going to use an algorithm to determine whether a defendant is angry if they're scowling, instead of paying really close attention to the proceedings, would you want your outcomes determined by that? I certainly wouldn't. And I think that's really what's at stake here. Another issue, which I'm not going to talk about today, is the fact that we often mistake statistical significance for actual significance in real life, right? When people scowl 28% of the time, more than better, which is better than chance, that's not the same as saying that we want to use that as the basis of detecting anger in real life. The real punchline here is that variation is the norm. Here's what I mean. When I show people this image, this face, people usually guess at how she's feeling. So how is she feeling, do you think? Sad, pain, grief, Relaxed. This is my daughter, Sophia, at the Cologne Museum for Chocolate. And I can tell you she's experiencing a profound sense of pleasure. She's on her second chocolate drink. This little sweetie is also experiencing pleasure. And so what's the lesson here? The lesson here is that people move their faces in many meaningful ways during instances of the same emotion category. Now, when we just look at this little guy's eyebrow region, what expression does it look like he's making? Anger. And in fact, we often see this face as anger. Does anyone know who this is, actually? This is a joke only that works in the Northeast in the US, and I'm not sure if it works in LA. Definitely works in California. This is actually Jim Webb, who won the senatorial race in Virginia in 2006 that returned the Senate to Democratic control in the United States. Now, no one's laughing here. But if you were in America, you would be laughing because everyone who is a Democrat wishes that the Senate would be returned. So I say to people, just channel that and simulate it for a minute and imagine how it might feel. And everyone breaks out laughing. So I'm just going to simulate the fact that you're laughing now. Without context, we see his face as anger because this face actually symbolizes anger in our culture. So people not only move their faces in different ways during instances of the same emotion category, they also move their faces in the same way during instances of different emotion categories. So I want to be really clear here. I'm not saying that people move their faces in random ways. I'm not saying that faces don't carry any information about someone's state. I am telling you that variation is the norm, meaning you can't just measure a face. Because a face doesn't speak for itself when it comes to emotion, right? People usually see this face on this body as smugness or pride or confidence, but actually it's the proposed universal face for disgust. And what's really interesting is that our proposed universal expression for fear, a wide-eyed gasping face, is actually the stereotypic anger face in Malaysia. So what's up with these expressions? Like, where did they come from? And the answer is they were not discovered by observing people express emotions in real life. They were stipulated by a handful of scientists and adopted as universal truth, and then scientists built a whole science around them. But basically, they're stereotypes. They are Western stereotypes. So basically, what we have is a science of emojis. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies which get published in the best journals of our field are using stereotypes rather than actual images of people or movies or actual people moving their actual faces in spontaneous ways. So we don't want to build AI on stereotypes. We want to build it on emotional episodes as they occur in real life. And I'm not going to talk too much about these faces, but if you remind me at the question and answer, I can tell you about some studies that we've run using these faces, which come from famous actors, asked to portray emotional episodes that are not impoverished, but actually have some context. And in the real world, this is what emotion looks like, right? In the real world, anger or sadness or fear is not an entity with a single biomarker. A word like anger refers to a category that is full of variety. And that is true when we look at faces, and it's true when we measure physiology, as a recent meta-analysis shows involving hundreds of studies. It's true when we look at brain activity in humans using neuroimaging, and it doesn't matter whether we're looking at activity in a region of the brain, whether we're looking at multivox analyses. It doesn't matter whether we are looking at intrinsic networks in the brain. Variety is the norm, meaning that you see different signatures for the same category across different instances or different studies, and you also see some similarities across categories. It doesn't matter whether we're looking at functional dynamics in those networks over time. We can look at electrical stimulation and measurement of individual neurons in humans, in live humans, or in animals. We can look at lesion studies. In all of these cases, what it shows is that emotion categories, any category, pick one, fear, is degenerate. What does that mean? It's a lovely biological term, which means there's more than one biomarker. There's more than one physiological pattern. There's more than one facial expression per category. And there is often overlap across categories. What you have to do is focus on the context. So I'm talking a lot about variation, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, okay, no one ever said that, you know, every single time someone's angry, they obligatorily scowl. No theory actually proposes that. And it's true that many theories of emotion do permit some variability, but the question is how much? And are they making up hypothesizing mechanisms after the fact, or is that variability predicted in an a priori context-based way? So what I'm going to do for you here is just really briefly summarize what some theories have to say. And along the horizontal axis, we're going to talk about, I'm going to focus on the surface similarity in the instances. So do all instances in an emotion category, like anger, share the same observable surface features, like a facial expression or a cardiovascular signal or something like that? And along the vertical axis, I'm going to talk about the inference of deep similarity. That is there a single essence or a single mechanism or a single function proposed for each category? And so the original proposal by Paul Ekman was that emotion categories had necessary and sufficient conditions. They were like classical categories. And there are a whole host of different theoretical views which suggests that emotions have some variability in them. So the instances of emotion within a category are somewhat variable, but usually variable around a prototype. So there's a single biomarker, but there's some variability around that biomarker. And that's true whether you're talking about the revised basic emotion view from Cowan and Keltner, whether you're talking about comprehensial view from Klaus Scherer's group, which admits in principle variability but never studies it, all the way down to the Ortonian Clore version of appraisal. Actually, at some point, it would be great if we could talk a little bit. I know a lot of people here are enamored with appraisal theory, and there are really big differences between something like Scherer's view and the Ortonian Clore view. So maybe someone will ask a question about that, and we can get to it. And those views are very different from my view and from, for example, Alan Fridlin's view, where the assumption is that that there's tremendous variability, both in the surface features and in the causal mechanisms. Not random variability, but that there's more than one way to create anger in the brain, that there's more than one cardiovascular pattern that corresponds to anger, and so on and so forth. Not two, not three, but many, And using machine learning like Gaussian mixture modeling and so on allows you to identify what those are, as we have in our lab. And so here, the colors represent the kind of category that these theories are proposing for emotion categories. Red is a classical category. Yellow is a prototype category, and green is a conceptual category, pretty much similar to what Darwin proposed for the category species in On the Origin of Species. Now, many of you know a lot about classification systems. You know more than I do, probably. And so you know what the definition of a category is. A category is a group of instances that are similar in some way. So if you were building a cat recognition system, you would develop a classifier that would learn the features that cats have in common and that are different from dogs and mice and fish and other kinds of things. And this category, get it, category? I promised my daughter I would make that joke. There, I made it. Is a collection of instances that have similar features. But notice that there's a lot of variation there too, right? So some cats are big, other cats are small. Some cats are small. There are different eye colors. There are different thicknesses of fur. Some cats don't even have fur. The human brain has a tendency to ignore this variation in favor of what cats have in common. But here's the thing. The categories that we deal with in everyday life are usually not defined by their physical features. They're defined by the function of the category in a given situation. So if I ask you to think of a cat store, your brain's going to construct an image of a good pet. If I ask you to think of a cat, a prototype of a cat, when you've just seen a mouse in your kitchen, you're going to conjure a bit of a different image of a cat. And when you're at a zoo, you get the picture. And so if I say, think about a cool cat on the prowl, you guys know this? Bill the cat from, no? Is it a cartoon strip? Okay. Or just a really cool cat, right? The prototype changes with the function in a given situation. These are called ad hoc categories or conceptual categories. Same thing with a bird. So in the classic experiments, you ask people, what's the prototype of a bird? And if you ask them a prototype of a bird and they're in the pet store, they're going to say a budgie. If you ask them the prototype of a bird and they're hungry, they're going to say a chicken, unless it's Thanksgiving, in which case they'll say a turkey, and so on and so forth. And so your brain combines what you know to that's relevant for that category in that situation. And our brains can actually make completely novel categories in this way too. This is an operating principle of your brain. It's called conceptual combination. So for example, if I ask you, what is this category? I would hazard a guess that everybody knows what this category is. It's a category that is completely constructed, doesn't exist in nature. By imposing functions on these objects that makes them similar. Can anyone tell me what this category is? Could be like shooting water, right? That gun could be a water pistol. Exactly. Give that man a prize. Yeah, these are things that you can't bring through airport security. This category is made on the basis of the similarity in function. And it exists inside your head and inside the head of every person who's ever flown on an airplane. And it exists only because I can refer to this category and you can understand what it means because we all agree by consensus that it's a category. This is a category of social reality where we impose functions on physical objects, and we agree on those imposed functions in such a way as to make them real, and real in real life. Now, there are many categories like this in civilization. In fact, almost all of the categories of human civilization are like this. Can anyone suggest like what a category of social reality where we impose functions collectively on objects and therefore give them a new meaning that they otherwise wouldn't have? Jewelry. Yes, absolutely, jewelry. Money is the perfect example. Right? There's nothing that is in common physically about all the things that humans have ever used as currency, from salt or barley or wood or diamonds or gold or pieces of paper or Bitcoin. Nothing, big rocks in the ocean that can't be moved, nothing that these instances share in a physical sense. What makes something currency is that a group of people agree that that thing can be traded for material goods, and then it actually has it actually takes on the meaning of currency. And we can study it objectively. We can stick people's heads in a scanner and offer them little pieces of paper of money and watch the so-called reward system light up in the brain. Okay, so what I'm suggesting to you today is that anger, sadness, fear, and other emotion categories are these kinds of categories. An elephant has no inherent meaning about airport security. We had to impose this meaning based on our shared knowledge of flying on an airplane. And so what I want to suggest is learning about these kinds of constructed categories is a category construction problem. It's not a classification problem. It's a category construction problem. And so the same thing, I think, is true in our culture and in every culture when it comes to emotion categories. We've learned to construct a meaning, impose a meaning on certain signals. We've all learned this, and that's why those physical signals have that function, have that meaning, because we've learned it. And so this is the way that you can transform a scowl or a cry or a stone-faced stare or even a sly smile into an instance of anger, by adding some additional meaning that comes from the perceiver who is detecting that physical signal, and also shared by the sender who's making that signal. And so if you want a machine to perceive emotions in humans, it has to learn how to solve this category construction problem, how to construct categories on the fly. Right? So emotion is not a category, it's not a classification problem where we should be using supervised machine learning techniques. It's a category construction problem. It's a problem of understanding the category that a scowl or something belongs to in a given instance, in a given situation. Because physical changes by themselves have no inherent emotional meaning. Someone or something has to impose that meaning on them. An increased heart rate is not a sign of fear, always. It's not always a fear signal. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. It can become fear when it serves a particular function in a particular situation. So emotions are not built in to your brain or your body. They are built by your brain and your body as you need them. And I think this is really hard to intuitively understand because our brain so automatically characterizes and categorizes without any sense of effort or awareness on our part. And so to us, it feels like we're just reading when, in fact, we're constructing. And so to give you an intuition for this, I'm going to use an example that perhaps you've seen before in other talks that I've given. This blobby image, which is called a Mooney image. So right now, billions of neurons in your brain are attempting to make sense of this image so that you see something other than black and white blobs. And what your brain is doing is it's searching through a lifetime of experiences, issuing thousands of guesses, weighing probabilities, trying to answer not what is this, but what is this like? What is this like from my past experience? And it's doing this in the blink of an eye. Now, if you just see black and white blobs instead of a fully formed image, then your brain hasn't found a good match, and you are in what philosophers call a state of experiential blindness. And so now I'm going to cure you of your blindness. Does anyone want to see that again? Yeah. So now, how many of you see a bee? Yeah. And the reason why your brain is now constructing the image of a bee is that when it goes searching for information to add to this image, to categorize this image, there's new knowledge there from the color photograph that you just saw. And this knowledge actually changes how you see the physical information on the slide. That is, your brain is categorizing the blobs using a memory of a bee. And so you see a bee, even though no bee is present. This kind of category-induced hallucination is business as usual for your brain. And my hypothesis is that your brain is constructing emotions in pretty much the same way. And so I'm just going to walk you through the logic of this. And what I'm going to do is summarize at a very sort of high level of analysis legions of neuroscience findings on this for the position that I'm about to describe. And so the way to make sense of this is to think about your brain as being stuck in a box, a dark, silent box called your skull. And what your brain is attempting to do is figure out what's going on in the outside world only from information that it's getting through the sensory channels of the body, the sights, sounds, smells, and other sense data that come to the brain through the body's sensors. Now, these sensory changes are the effects of things in the world. They have some cause, but your brain doesn't know what the cause is. It only knows what the effects are. So it has to guess at what the causes are so that it knows what to do about them. And the same thing is true about sense data that come from your body, which is ambiguous and noisy and incomplete. So a given ache in your stomach could be hunger in one context. It could be longing or anxiety in another context. It could be evidence that a defendant can't be trusted in a legal context. And so your brain has to determine the causes of sensations when it only has access to the effects. This is the classic example of a reverse inference problem. And so how does your brain solve this reverse inference problem? By remembering past experiences that are similar in some way to the present. When physical changes in the world and in the body are functionally similar to the present conditions. So your brain is asking, what is this pattern like from my past experience? What is it similar to? So it's constructing ad hoc categories. And so your brain, the hypothesis is your brain is constructing ad hoc categories as potential explanations for incoming sense data so that it knows what to do next about those data. It knows what they are, so it knows what to do about them. And these ad hoc categories represent the potential causal relationships between events in the body and in the world as they are right now and the predicted sensory consequences in a moment from now. So a category like anger or sadness or fear or things that you can't take through airport security or even a cat are not single representations stored in your brain somewhere. They're not a single tidbit of knowledge that you can pull up anytime you need it, like a file from a drawer. When your brain is constructing a category, it's constructing a category on the fly using past experiences in a highly situated way for the purposes of controlling action. So, for example, How many of you have ever seen actual electronic towers playing jump rope in real life? I haven't either. It would be awesome if it would be cool, right? But how many of you want this to be towers playing jump rope? Yeah. How did you do that? Because your brain constructed an ad hoc category out of bits and pieces of past experience in a generative way, or using what we would call conceptual combination. And what's interesting about these categories is they're also embodied. So how many of you can feel the thud of the tower jumping in your chest? How is it that you feel that? Because when your brain is constructing a category, what it's fundamentally doing is it's changing the firing of its own sensory neurons. And again, if this were a different kind of talk with, with more time, I could show you not one study, not 10 studies, but hundreds of studies which show this to be the case. When I ask you to imagine an apple in your mind's eye, like a red delicious apple, or if you ever hear a song playing in your head that you can't get out of your head, or when you're looking at someone's face and they're scowling, and your brain is constructing a representation of anger, your brain is, when it's constructing this category, is changing the firing of its own neurons, so that you fill in the dots, so to speak, right? So instead of a blobby bee, you see and feel an electron tower jumping, or you see an angry person, or so on and so forth. Now, I was going to walk you through this one more time because it is a little bit of a complicated, if I could find my cursor. Can't find my cursor. All right, well, I guess I'm going to go through this with you quickly. So here's a simplified explanation. Your brain is basically mostly talking to itself. This is what neuroscientists call intrinsic activity. It starts with initial conditions in the body and the world, and it projects itself forward in time, predicting what the body has to do next, as well as the expected sensory consequences of those actions. These predictions are ad hoc categories that your brain is constructing that actually change the firing of sensory neurons so that your brain begins to construct the experience it's expecting from the sense data in a moment from now, and to prepare action before those anticipated sensory inputs arrive. And so these are the candidates to make incoming sensory inputs meaningful so that your brain knows what to do about them. When the sense data arrive continuously, they either confirm these predictions, in which case the sensory inputs, the sense data are categorized, or if they have mispredicted, then your brain can change its predictions. And that is, the brain takes in new information so that it can predict better next time. And we have a fancy name for this in psychology. We call it learning. This is how changes in air pressure become sound, how changes in wavelengths of light become vision, how changes in chemical concentrations become smell, and so on, and how your brain builds emotions. Emotions are not reactions to the world. They are your brain's constructions of the world, or more precisely, your brain's understanding, that is, your brain's categorization of what is going on inside its own body, like an ache, in relation to what's going on around you in the world, like being in a doctor's office. The emotions that you experience are basically your brain's constructions constrained by data, sense data from your body and the world. And so emotions that seem to happen to you are actually made by you without any awareness and effort on your part, for the most part. And categorization is also how you see emotions in other people. Your brain remembers your past experiences from similar situations to impose meaning on the present. And this is how the curl of a lip or the raise of an eyebrow becomes a meaningful facial expression to you. And so the emotions that you seem to detect in other people are partly constructed inside your own head. So when one person perceives emotion in another person, that person is not detecting emotions. That person their brain is guessing, constructing an emotion category in the moment. And this is how a single physical feature can take on many different emotional meanings. So the summary here is that for a machine to perceive emotion, it has to be trained on more than stereotypes. It has to capture the full extent of high-dimensional detail, not just in a face and a body, not just in a face or in a body, and so on, which, these physical signals are inherently ambiguous without context. So if we really want to improve our ability to perceive emotion, to infer the emotional meaning of physical signals, we have to figure out how machines can learn to construct categories using features from biology in context. And I want to point out here that I'm using the word context rather liberally here, because context includes the reactions of other people. We are social animals. And we regulate each other's nervous systems in many ways that we're completely unaware of. And so other humans make up an important part of this context. So when I'm talking about context, I'm not just talking about the physical things in the environment. I'm also talking about what's going on inside your own body now and in a moment ago, right? So there's a temporal context. And I'm also talking about the social context as well. Because the physical changes in one person's body is the context for another person. And so we might want to measure the features of other people, too, as part of the context. Now, I was going to talk about whether machines can experience emotion and what features or what factors we would have to think about in order to really build a machine that could experience emotion, but I'm out of time, conveniently, and so I will leave that for the question and answer if anyone has a question. I'm just going to leave this slide up, but normally when I get to the end of my talks, I flash a slide of my lab, who are a large number of people who are very dedicated scientists who actually do all the really hard work on the ground. And so I'll just end by thanking them and thanking you, and I will take your questions.